Welcome to Jessum Guy's podcast. I'm Jessum Guy, and this is episode 13. In this episode, we're going to talk about Jacques Attali and his book, Brief History of the Future. Trigger warning, I'm probably going to do a very bad and possibly racist French accent when talking about this dude this episode. As always, we begin with who is this guy and why do we care what he has to say? Well, Jacques Attali is a French economic and social theorist, but he is mostly known as counselor to President François Mitterrand from 1981 to 1991. He was also the founder and first head of the European Bank for Reconstruction and Development from 91 to 93 before he was forced out of his own bank. The EBRD, as it's also known, had been established in 91 with high hopes of financing key aspects of the Eastern European transition to post-communist regimes and economies. Its mission was to channel multilateral public lending by Western governments to rebuild Eastern Europe. It was to supplement private business investment from the West, making sound investments that private sector investors refused to take on. In particular, it would aid privatization schemes while tangentially storing up small amounts of French public financial political leverage against the weight of unmatchable private German investment in Eastern Europe. Attali is also known as the architect of Emmanuel Macron's economic policy. Attali is even quoted as saying, "Emmanuel Macron? I discovered him. I invented him." Prior to this, Macron was a banker at Rothschild. Attali is also a Bilderberg member. He attended their conference in 1975 before all of this. And of course, Attali is a member of the World Economic Forum. Of course he is. In 2009, Foreign Policy magazine called him one of the top 100 global thinkers in the world. So not only is Attali checking all of these boxes, but he's also had over 50 books published dealing with economics, social theory, and he's described as a futurist writer, as well as politics. Here are a couple blurbs describing his work. His work reveals a distinct vision of history and its successive stages, which are simultaneously ideological, technological, and geopolitical. Furthermore, his work entails depicting the slow transformation of humanity into an artifact in which man becomes an object to escape death, and the geopolitical evolution toward chaos that accompanies such transformation. Meanwhile, man is also waiting for an awakening leading to a new global governance, a sanctification of the essential makeup of mankind, taking into account the interest of future generations and not letting prosthesis invade it. Attali advocates the establishment of a global rule of law, which will condition the survival of democracy through the creation of a new global order. He thinks the regulation of the economy by a global financial supervisory institution may be a solution to the financial crisis which started in 2008. The financial institution is a first step towards the establishment of a democratic world government, of which the European Union can be a laboratory, which was all laid bare in his 1981 book, verbatim. Again described as a futurist, he is credited with foreseeing and announcing signals of the future that later came to be true. Some of these were the shift from an energy-based society to an information-based society. He announced what would later be the internet, YouTube, and the importance of musical practice. He discussed the coming emergence of the personal computer, hypersurveillance, and self-surveillance. He announced the shift of the center of power around the Pacific. He announced the advent of a prosthetic society known as transhumanism. And what seems to be most relevant now is he announced a corporate power grab by health data and insurance companies. So, given his history, his background, his track record, I think it makes sense to go ahead and read his book, Brief History of the Future, and take kind of seriously some of the claims that he's going to make about what our future is going to look like. And given the times and all the new information we've uncovered about this Great Reset over the last few years, you will see that he was very much aware of this long-range plan that we see unfolding today. And without further ado, let's get into the book. The book is separated in two halves. The first half is sort of a history lesson. The second half is all his future predictions. The first half reads as an esoteric version of Tragedy and Hope. He is going to go through, starting in chapter 2, the brief history of capitalism, where he's going to take us through each stage of capitalism, just like Quigley did, except for his surrounds what he calls a core or a center. He is going to take that up to present day, which is in California. And from there, he's going to speak about how this current form we're in is going to end. Then he's going to talk about the end of the American Empire. He says we're going to go through the next couple of waves of the future, which is planetary empire. Then we're going to get into some planetary war. And all this is going to lead to a planetary democracy. And so I'm going to make this a two-part series. The first part will cover the first half, the history lesson, the history of capitalism. And then the second part, part 2, will deal with his future predictions. And as we get into the foreword, he's going to start with a list of crises that we must face and overcome. But he says, regardless of these crises we face, other powerful movements, unchanging, will continue their work. History flows in one particular direction in which no upheaval can deflect. Humankind has asserted the primacy of individual freedom over all other values. He says it has done so through the rejection of all forms of servitude, through technical advances aimed at minimizing human effort, and through liberalization of lifestyles, political systems, art, and ideologies. Human history relates the individual's assumption of his rights as an entity legally empowered to plan and master his fate, and get this, free of all constraints. That is the key phrase here, free from all constraints. This is the same libertarian liberal democracy that Quigley lays out starting on page 24 in Tragedy and Hope. This was the original plan by the banking elite to remove all constraints that are barriers to the market, which you are seeing come to a full flowering with gender ideology. You see, everything that is a barrier to free market capitalism must be removed in the name of rights. Yes, I did rights in scare quotes. He calls the triumphant march of money the ultimate expression of unchecked individualism. This phrase, unchecked individualism, is something we're going to dig into shortly. He says this is behind history's recent convulsions, as in revolutions like the French and American and Bolshevik and sexual revolutions. He says this evolutionary process means that money will rid itself of everything that threatens it, including nation states, even the United States, which it will dismantle. Once the market becomes the world's only universally recognized law, it will evolve into what he calls super empire. Notice the language used here. He calls this an evolutionary process, that it will evolve into super empire, as if this is just the natural process of mankind. This is why I fight Darwinism as a metaphysic as hard as I do. He says if we balk at this, we could fall back into barbarous times in an era of hyper-conflict. But if globalization and democracy can spread planet-wide, we will enter hyper-democracy, which will culminate into a world government. He says they already gave birth to political freedom in these market democracies, which displaced religious and military power everywhere. He says these market democracies were born in the 12th century. So he makes the point that at every stage of capitalism and every new one of these cores, they surround or come from new technology. These new technologies expand freedoms. The printing press, the electric motor, elevators, they're all used as examples of how it liberated people from the church and from the nuclear family. When we get into reading through the lens of de Jouvenel's On Power, you'll see that this is dialectical. It's a paradox. Each advance of freedom also achieved, as Attali will suggest, more centralization of power. Each new technology, which gave birth to a new core, allowed the next elite to replace the existing orders and centralize power, which is the ultimate goal of these people. And so, if this continues, markets and democracies will spread everywhere. He even admits this will lead to a gap widening between the rich and the poor, leading to social upheavals. By 2035, the United States will be defeated by this and by corporations. By 2060, we will have a hyper-democracy with enforced austerity, limits to production and consumption, led by transhumans and artificial intelligence. They're going to limit what you can consume. They're going to limit what you can produce. They're going to limit your access to natural resources. You're going to eat the bugs and live in the pods. Everything will be rationed based on some social credit score, and it's all going to be controlled by AI. And that was just the foreword, which essentially was just a brief summary outline of the table of contents and what the entire book is about. And as we move into chapter 1, as I stated before, the first 2 chapters, which make up about the first half of the book, is just a history lesson. Mainly the history of nomadism, which he is obsessed with, and the history of capitalism, again, which is a esoteric telling of tragedy and hope. So with this one, I'm not going to read through page by page, since he pretty much repeats himself, but he has 4 central main points that we're going to focus on. First, he talks about the merchant powers versus the religious and the military powers. These powers have always coexisted and competed for power. This merchant order destroyed the other orders with freedoms. He makes the point that it is the merchant order that is individualistic. Individualism is a merchant ideal. He says they began as a parasite living within these imperiums, then competing with them, then supplanting the princes with merchants. They purge every institution. He says this mercantile order pries its way into the cracks and is revolutionary. Oh, revolutions are banker plots. And interesting here on this page, he also lays out the same ideals as our founding fathers, describing the legislative, executive, and judicial. Also, I want to point out the Masonic origins of these ideals. Now, Attali never claims or even speaks of Freemasons, just to be clear, but the parallels are there. But this merchant versus other orders brings us to the second major point. It is the merchant order that is responsible for democracy and the liberal libertarian ideologies. These were needed to destroy the existing orders. Again, this is all laid out in Tragedy and Hope starting on page 24. This is the purpose of freedoms. Capitalism must break down all barriers and, as Attali states, remove all constraints. Thus, liberalism and democracy and the promise of more freedoms were the tools the merchant order used to break down the existing orders and destroy the dynastic monarchies. And they are used today to further erode cultures and identities that are still barriers. So when he says freedom, he doesn't mean as in free from bondage or being sovereign. He means free from constraints to pursue base desires. Anyone who has read Bertrand de Jouvenel's On Power should be immediately recognizing this. Or even if you've read Moldbug's work, which is just an updated version of On Power. And for the dry history, this is explained in great detail in Tragedy and Hope. This is your high-low versus middle, where the center and the subsidiary compete for power by using the periphery. Attali's telling of history is confirming this is indeed the model. Remember, he calls the march of money the ultimate expression of unchecked individualism. To put a pin in this, I'll read a quote from Jouvenel on his idea of liberal individualism, this unchecked individualism, and the ruse of popular sovereignty. Where will it all end? In the destruction of all other command for the benefit of one alone, that of the state, and each man's absolute freedom from every family and social authority, a freedom the price of which is complete submission to the state. In the complete equality as between themselves of all citizens, paid for by their equal abasement before the power of their absolute master, the state. In the disappearance of every constraint which does not emanate from the state, and in the denial of every preeminence which is not approved by the state. In a word, it ends in the atomization of society, and in the rupture of every private tie linking man and man, whose only bond is now their common bondage to the state. The extremes of individualism and socialism meet. That was their predestined course. So, as you see, de Jouvenel understood this dialectic. And here on this page, Attali plainly states it. Capitalism and democracy doomed these empires, and they wrestled power from their religious and military orders. There is a guy on YouTube, if you don't know, Academic Agent. I must add, he has a couple really good short videos that dig into this and like a brief history for those who are unfamiliar and who have not read de Jouvenel. Attali also mentions these merchant bankers financing wars which further succeeded in destroying thousand-year-old empires. Also note the reference to using Muslims, funding and arming Muslims to help bankers. And speaking of wars, Attali says what Quigley said before. Wars speed up progress. And the purpose of World War I was to finalize the splitting up of these dynastic monarchies. And here, this last paragraph, this last statement, you can read this as sort of an identifier of these little great resets they manufacture to move to the next phase, or as Attali says, the new core. These economic crises that we see are not accidental or a product of the system per se. They are created, they're manufactured and engineered. One of the other functions the merchant orders are responsible for is the advancement of technology and information and travel, which accelerates globalization. They also force open markets with the power of the state and military, imposing democracy and free trade. And this helps lead into the next major point of this chapter, and that is Attali discussing this idea of cores or forms. His thesis is that they build around a central core and they move from one core to another. This core attracts what Attali calls the innovative class. The foreign-born elites migrate to these great cores. The purpose of this is because the accumulation of capital can't be pursued by a firm or a family because they are too fragile, but it is pursued by this core or capital, as in capital city, which becomes the organizing center of capitalism. Quote, "The mercantile order speaks a single language, that of money. It constantly reinvents itself in a unique shape, around a single center, a single core, which attracts an innovative class, marked by its taste for the new and its passion for discovery, until a crisis or a war leads to the replacement of one core by another. This springs from the very nature of the new order. Markets and democracy are founded on the organization of competition, resulting in insistence on the new and in the selection of an elite. Moreover, in the very long term, accumulation of capital cannot be pursued in a firm or a family, both of which are fragile units. It is pursued in a city, a core that becomes the organizing center of capitalism. Finally, competition implies battle, and there will therefore be a continuum between market democracy and violence. All cores must necessarily have a vast hinterland for the development of agriculture and a big port to export their produce. All these cores respond to a lack that otherwise would destroy them. All develop direction from the top in order to gain the upper hand over competition. Emulation, rigor, force, state control, protectionism, and the mastery of the exchange rates are their weapons. A city becomes a core if its innovative class is in a better position than anyone else to transform a service into an industrial product. To achieve this, it must master capital, fix prices, gather in the profits, hold wages in check, deploy an army, bankroll explorers, and nurture the ideology that guarantees its power. He continues, form by form, the production of agricultural and later man-made goods is industrialized. Form by form, slaves disappear and paid labor takes their place. Form by form, production of energy and information becomes automated. Form by form, engineers, merchants, bankers, shipbuilders, fighting men, artists, and intellectuals relocate. Form by form, the fields of individual freedom, of the market, and of democracy expand. Form by form, peasants, craftsmen, and independent workers are transformed into insecure wage earners. Form by form, wealth is concentrated in a shrinking number of hands. Wider freedoms are enjoyed by consumers and citizens, and greater alienations are inflicted on the workers." End quote. So he tells us that there have been 9 successive forms that can be designated by the name of the core city. They also can be identified by the roster of services they progressively transformed into mass consumer goods, and by the technology that they produce. Now, as he takes us through the successive cores, he also takes us through the stages of capitalism, much like Quigley did in Tragedy and Hope. And one of the other central points he will make through each core is the creating of new technologies that lead to services which are imperative to the core. We see this since World War II and the Department of Defense and DARPA getting mass research and development funding with tax dollars for weapon systems and such that eventually lead to commercial products that assist in their control, like the cell phone and the internet, social media, GPS, etc. And to another point, much of this research and development being funded with tax dollars that lead to commercial products that make millionaires and billionaires that then turn around and skirt taxes with their tax-exempt foundations or just making agreements with the state to produce their goods there. And then they use that money to further consolidate their control. To an extent, I say some Marxists have it right, that when a tech gets created that leads to billions, that we should all get a stake in that, since most of the research funds come from our tax dollars anyways. And with that, we start in 1200. Apparently this all started in Bruges, And what's important about this claim is that it shows a continuity of ideas and goals through time, a conspiracy, if you will. According to Attali, it all started with Jews being the only people group theologically being allowed to practice usury. That's his words, not mine. Again, see Quigley. They created banking. This is the basis of capitalism. Not as like the tards and changing images of man said, which, as I pointed out, was horrible interpretation of history. Capitalism should be more defined not as trade or as free market for exchange, but built on usury and debt. Capital investing in more capital and growth, essentially. So Bruges became the first core with capitalism. The next core was in Venice, where the black nobility was. That is an interesting topic in its own right. Venice advanced the stage of capitalism. Venice is the first to gather check and holding companies into stock exchanges, trading houses, banks, and insurance companies. Also the first to have ships chartered by shareholding companies. And yes, Quigley even names Venice when talking about his stages of capitalism. And the next core was Antwerp. In this core, at this phase, they began to control an entire core, not with armies, but with control of markets and currency and the exchange rates. And here he talks about the advancing of technology necessary for the cores, as we talked earlier at the very beginning. And then this one, he uses the printing press as an example, and that it accelerated the transmission of data. He says the book became the first mass-produced nomadic object and will not be the last. He seems to have this obsession with nomadic objects. It almost seems as if all advances of technology seems to have that singular goal in mind. Nomadism could be almost a euphemism for, rootless, deracinated cosmopolitan. The next core was in Genoa. New methods of accounting were invented. Again, mastered the gold trade, fixed exchange rates of all currencies, and interest loans to kings. More advances in capitalism. Again, as pointed out by Quigley, the early banker model of gold standard and manipulating exchange rates, money off of speculation and not production. The next core was Amsterdam, the rise of corporations like the Dutch East India Company. This is the stage of commercial capitalism organized by charter companies. Now, his timeline is a little different from Quigley, but Attali is laying out the stages as they move from core to core. The next core was London. At this time, nationalism becomes a force, which of course he means we just had two major revolutions and a war for independence. Again, nationalism was a liberal idea. London is the first market democracy, and Attali gives praise to liberty, equality, and fraternity. Once again, the Masonic dictum. This stage of capitalism in London is moving from industrial to financial capitalism, the financing of steel industry for railroads and ships, something that originated in a Rothschild bank, no less. This part is actually covered in Tragedy and Hope on 48 through 51. The core moves to the U.S. for the first time in Boston. It will be the first center for American capitalism. The First World War hastened the transfer of power to America. Again, Tragedy and Hope. From there, the core moves to New York. So begins consumer capitalism. This core built around electricity and the electric motor. New consumer products moves us more in the direction of nomadism. After breaking down dynasties and the monarchies and imperiums, the next barrier is the family. This is the next main point we will get to in just a minute. This is the era through World War II, which ushers in the current stage of capitalism. This is the start of the technotronic and managerial era. Full professions are created to convince people to spend and not to save, and bank loans to households rise. I think Jay Dyer covered this in one of his RAND talks, that this idea came out of these think tanks. The core then moves to its current location in LA. If it's not already obvious, Silicon Valley. the industrialized information. Again, the push towards nomadic objects by miniaturizing everything and being able to store more info in smaller objects that are not portable. I'm telling you, the dude is obsessed with nomads. But, what can you expect from a rootless cosmopolitan such as Attali? And from here, he goes on to discuss this core's demise and where the proposed next core could be located. He names La Jolla in California, by the way. But before we press on, the final point to cover that he makes in this history lesson, that is toxic ideologies, social changes necessary for the merchant order, the actual results of all the freedoms, and the changes in mores, values, the family, society, and social relationships. We'll take a step back once we got into the part on London as the core. This is at the height of revolutions, and Attali states that London becomes the place where all the intellectuals are. This is something Jay Dyer has discussed multiple times, how London has been sort of the birthplace for a lot of toxic ideologies, as well as being a central point of modern Freemasonry. Keep this in mind as we read what Attali has to say about changes brought on by freedoms and advancements in technologies that go with these new ideologies. One of the points Attali makes at each core, the mercantile order transforms new services into industrial products and peasants into poorly paid wage earners. It concentrates more and more wealth into fewer and fewer hands and procures greater freedoms for consumers while further alienation on workers. He is being upfront and honest with what the results are. Interesting note here on this page, this is where surveillance begins with paper tracking. So after dismantling previous imperiums and dynasties, the next barrier is the family. And where did they start? The women, of course. You see, Attali called women who stayed home and looked after the family, which abetted the continuity of rural lifestyle, a, quote, dead weight on the profitability of the economy. Oh, so now we're starting to understand women's rights, in scare quotes. We need to get those kids and women in 18-hour shifts at the factory for shit wages and alienation. This is what women's rights and freedoms are. This is why it's always been funded by bankers, to convince you to be a wage slave over caring for your family. We pick this idea back up when the core moves to New York and the invention of electricity and the electric motor. Quote, as with the 7 preceding forms, the birth of an 8th presupposes uniting the cultural, political, and economic conditions for replacing services, whether paid or free, with new mass-produced machinery. Following the industrialization of farm, clothing, and transportation production, it is the electric motor that will now replace, via electric household equipment, the domestic services provided by women in the home or in domestic employment. He continues, the electric motor permits the building of elevators, and therefore the construction of skyscrapers, a boon to the concept of vertical city planning. The electric motor thus plays an indirect role in rural migration and in the trend towards smaller families. It creates a market for machines capable of replacing a large portion of domestic chores and apartments steadily shrinking in size. America is particularly well placed to succeed in this migration to its giant cities. Women's magazines and the feminist movement also prepare women, better than elsewhere, to accept their new status as consumers. Thus, under the guise of liberating women, the market proclaims their servility. I'm sorry, this is fucking hilarious. I don't remember where I read it or if it was in a documentary, but it was pointed out that this was the purpose of electric household products and easy bake boxed ingredients, frozen dinners with microwaves, all to reduce the labor time spent by women in the house to move them from their homes to be a cog in the machinery of industry. Not done to help women, but to pull women from their homes, breaking up the nuclear family. And you thought liberating women from their home was empowerment. Silly you. And we know by reading a lot of these globalists that population control is a big deal to them. So I found it pretty striking that he says that the electric motor and the elevator allows them to build up instead of out, which indirectly contributes to smaller families. Just makes you think about like the technologies we're given, really what their purposes are. Another function of all this technology and freedoms in affecting values and changing social structures to be more amenable to capital was, as Attali says, the direct link between technology and sexuality, which underpins the whole dynamic of this mercantile order. This being directed at the youth and brings them into the world of consumption. It's a worn-out meme at this point, but it goes something like, Global Homo is interested in your kids. Indeed. Spurring on consumption was a goal and was a reason for the attack on the middle class because, as Attali says, they saved as opposed to spending. This is where admin like Bernays comes in, as well as the media and Hollywood with their propaganda, creating the consumer culture. This is when bank loans to American households increase, creating a nation of debtors. And finally, we get to Attali's obsession with nomadism. All of these advances in tech, all of the miniaturizing and combining features, and additional memory and data storage and devices, the whole thing is in the direction of nomadism, or what some have described as creating a world of rootless, deracinated, empty vessels without a homeland or identity or culture, just blind, mindless consumers on the go. And that's the history of capitalism, which is going to bring us up to Attali's predicting the future. This is where it's going to get pretty fun.